We come to dance when a baby is born, during marriages, or when a loved one joins dances. The music and dance is an aspect that covers every part of beautiful life. I want to thank you all today for beautiful style dances in Nigeria. Thank you.
That was what the next that was the band remember that when he got his drum cemetery and somebody came and said and what somebody getting married this time Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, the next dance we're going to dance is what we call the Orchard dance. Oh, well, music and dance have something really good. Not long ago, our ancestors, they have no way of knowing when it's time to plant the seed. The doctor was not found. So they went to tell them how to know what it is to do to really handle plant food. So the people told them they need to do something to sacrifice bread, and after that they told them once in a year a giant dog will come from the forest, and then that will show them the sign when it's time to prepare to plant the seed. But once this giant dog arrived, they were warned that they should not kill that giant. If they do, the world is going to turn against them. So the farmers, they listen to that advice, and we're going to show you that kind of dance, the offering, we call it offering dance. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Knoxville Museum of Art, I'm pleased to have you here. My name is Stephen Wicks, and I'm the museum's curator. I can tell you that we are thrilled to be part of Africa Week. When Rosalind Hackett first came to us months and months ago about this project, right away we were excited. It's another chance for us to collaborate with the university, but more importantly, bring to Knoxville some of the key Yoruba scholars right now in this country. And we've got a distinguished panel right here before us tonight. It's a fantastic opportunity to learn more about African art. As a graduate student in art history, I was intrigued by African art and the way in which it permeates every facet of culture in African life. And it's something that I wish would happen more with Western art. So often tucked away in museums and galleries, and I think it's dynamic to learn about how African art is, again, intimately tied to almost every facet of African life. And I think we'll learn more about that tonight. I'd like to thank Dr. Hackett, who helped put this entire project together, and the incredible work that she did in organizing it and bringing down our key speakers. So let's have a round of applause for Dr. Hackett. And then I'd like to turn things over to Ralph Norman, who will talk on behalf of the University of Tennessee.
You'll forgive me if I fondle this a bit. I've always wanted to have one of these ever since I saw Mel Brooks sing High Anxiety using the recent movies. I'm supposed to and want to welcome all of you on behalf of the University of Tennessee to this occasion. But in some ways, it is like a traffic policeman welcoming all people who are coming from different directions into the center of traffic. That's because tonight represents a kind of transaction, a kind of crossroads of several narratives that I think we ought to mention, or at least mark, as we continue these undertakings. There is the narrative or the story which begins a long time back, probably 150, 200 years ago, in the Western intellectual tradition, in which a whole lot of people began to work on the notion that art is something separate and unique, and there's something called the aesthetic experience that doesn't have anything to do with the religious experience or the political experience, the social experience. It's just pure, unadulterated, the aesthetic experience. That's art. We had, for a very long time, in lots of departments of our inquiry and understanding, this very sharp division. If you were studying literature, you studied it for its artistic, it's formal, it's strictly separate meaning and purpose. That's one story that's come along for 150 years, and we're now about at the end of it for a variety of reasons that you can't go into here. The second story is the story of the university, which also, for a long, long time, over 100 years, has had the notion that you could keep art separate from politics, which was separate from religion, which was separate from literature. You had all these separate departments, and each did their own thing, and that's all they did. And that story has also sort of come now. And this Africa Week is part of the conclusion of that. Or what you say, the end of that. And the third narrative is the narrative of museums. Museums, as a popular undertaking, belong really only about 150 years old now. Many of the greatest museums of our world came about when France or England or Germany had finished conquering some other part of the world. When Napoleon came back from Egypt and from other places that he had succeeded in, he brought the loot and treasure from those places with him. Since Alexander the Great had gone to Egypt, he went to Egypt too, and he brought back all kinds of information about Egypt and all the cultural and art objects of Egypt. The British went to Greece and brought back what they called the Elgin marbles. The Germans did other things of a similar kind. So museums came into being. And for a long time, people thought that a museum was kind of like an encyclopedia. You went to a museum and they would tell you exactly what period each thing belonged to. So if you went into the first hall, you would first go to the ancient Egyptians, you then go to the Greeks, see that hall, that period. And the university had all kinds of guidebooks to help you see exactly where everything belonged. But something happened in the course of the history of the museum when they became open to people. And they weren't just places for the elite to gather and to congratulate themselves. Something happened, and that was, it was a little bit like the story we often heard of the toy shop that is closed at night, and while the master is the owner is away, all the toys begin to dance around and celebrate. Well, something like that happened in museums. The objects of inspection began to have their own power and their own uniqueness and their own thrust, their own command. And very soon people who went to museums found that the objects they were looking at made demands upon them that they couldn't just deal with in an ordinary, civil way. They had to look at them in a very different way. They were challenged by them. And so museums came to be not places where you learn just what you learned in school, that is the encyclopedic notion of the history of the world, but they raise questions to you. They put a mirror in front of you and ask, what do you think of all this? Where are you in respect to all this? And that's where museums like the KMA come in. That's where the many museums in the world come in, because they don't just tell you where it is located and situated. They say, the world and its cultures are up for grabs. We don't know what this is all coming to. We're all part of it. And you can't separate the religion from the art and the culture. And you may have noticed this week, that's what Africa Week is all about. We're all in this together. We're looking. Not the Museum of Art is showing us some things that we have got to make our own judgments about it. They're not going to tell us where all this fits together. That's why we have a symposium tonight. That's why we have a museum here. That's why, as it turns out, we have a university. So we're pleased to welcome you, and without any credentials whatever, as a traffic cop, in this transactional narrative, I welcome you, and I'm excited about what we've seen, what we're going to hear, what we're going to deliberate in these days together.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for those ever-inspiring reflections. I want to say that it is indeed my honor and great pleasure to be able to address you on this occasion tonight and to welcome you all here. In fact, to be honest with you, it is really a dream come true, because when we started thinking about the possibility of doing this just under a year ago, it certainly didn't have this sort of this complexity that the week of the symposium has turned into now. It's got bigger and bigger as we work towards it and talk more about it, and that has been exciting and encouraging that the Knoxville community has shown so much interest and support. I want to start just, of course, by saying a few thank yous, otherwise none of this would be possible. And because I'm sleep deprived and so excited, you will excuse me if I do read off the list, because otherwise I will continue to be sleepless if I forget to thank somebody who should be thanked. I want to start by thanking the two people who gave us the visibility, because you can organize anything in any place, but if people don't know about it, it's virtually worthless. And I wonder if there's anyone in this room who's seen beautiful poster than this. I'm very happy that we have the two people who devoted their time and creative energy to making this poster and the flyer a possibility and a reality. So, they are sitting over there, Diane, Fox, and Bobby Lyon. Will you please stand up? Teaches graphic design and photography at UT Chattanooga, and Beauvais teaches printmaking at UT. And it's been a pleasure working with them, and I will be eternally grateful to them. And of course, none of this happens without money. And I'm just sorry that the person who's really put so much into this in terms of financial and moral support, Vice Chancellor Phil Schurer, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, but he can't be here and receive his accolades, and he's busy with the Board of Trustees. And I want to thank the Knoxville Museum of Art staff. It's been a joy coming down here on numerous occasions, working with them and learning what it takes to make something like this a reality. And I particularly want to thank Steve Wicks and Beverly Broyles for their stellar efforts in supporting this and their enthusiasm. And I hope we can do it again sometime, but not next year. I think it's time. I also want to thank the African Student Association. Some of them are here tonight. It's always a pleasure working with them, and a privilege. And I'm going to make Amadou Sal stand up. Amadou, please. If you haven't met, you don't know who Amadou Sal is, I wonder where you've been hiding. Because Amadou is the unofficial, perhaps the official African ambassador at large for East Tennessee. He seems to get in all the newspapers, all the university literature, and deservedly so, because he works so hard to promote things African, and he and I have worked together to make this a reality, and it wouldn't have been possible without him. He is always there when needed. So Amadou, je te remercie infiniment. Thank you. I also want to thank the student volunteers. There are several who've helped tonight in various capacities. I can't name them all, but you know who you are, and thank you very much. Of course, now the musicians are heading back to Alabama, but I know that you'll agree with me that they have made this week so far just wonderful. As Amadou said last night, those of us who are African and love Africa know that there is a lot to share, there's a lot of value, and I think that was a reality tonight. It was last night when half the audience at the dance and drum performance were on the stage, old and young. I mean, it was an amazing sight. So we thank them, and we hope to have them back in Knoxville before too long. I also want to thank moderators tonight in anticipation, Wilma Dykeman, who in the midst of her busy schedule, she's just arrived back from Chattanooga, graciously agreed to chair this symposium, and she's going to tell you a bit about her interest in African art, and we're so grateful that she could do this. And I also want to thank in anticipation other moderators, Yumi Durutoye, who's here, he'll also be on the panel, and Halloran Hill, well known to some of you, he will be moderating tomorrow afternoon's session. Now, of course, this wouldn't be a reality without all of these people here on my right, all these speakers. And it would take me forever and a day to convey to you their eminence, their energy, their intellectual capacities, their humor. The nouns and the adjectives could go on. But they don't ask me
me how we managed to get them all here tonight, but they are all here, and you are going to enjoy them, and you're going to learn from them. Some of us, we've already done that in class today and yesterday. And I'm going to very quickly just run down their names, and then you can read about them. But that's just scratching the surface of what they've done and who they are. And before I just say a few more things, on my closest to me is Dele Jegede. Next to him is Moyo Okeneji. Next to him is Tunde Gawal. We have Roland Dyken, and we have Roland Adyodun. And then we have, can't see him, but I know he's there, Bolaji Campbell, my colleague and resident artist at UT this semester. Then we have Professor Shope Oyedara, and then we have Professor Michael Harris on the end. And there are more going to join them tomorrow, so the panels will change their shape a bit. So we thank you for coming, and we hope that you're going to enjoy this as much as we're going to enjoy and appreciate you. So let's share your support. Yeah. And I just very quickly want to say, Africa Week is not new to UT Knoxville. We've been doing this for 10 years. This is our 10th year. That's one of the reasons why this is rather a big bash this year. Now, of course, I've heard various rumors circulating about why this is such an ambitious Africa Week. And let me just tell you very quickly, in ascending order of significance, what I've heard. First, that I didn't have enough to do. That's true. That I needed to lose some weight. I did. 3, I wanted an excuse for a big party. Yeah, we are going to have that. 4, I lured Floyd to launch my book. I'm not that masochistic. 5thly, I wanted to share my love of Africa with a wider audience than I do on a daily basis with my students. I wanted to share just how challenging and valuable African life and thought and culture can be. Now, why have we chosen to focus on the Yoruba? Well, quickly, there's some reasons for that. One of them is that gentleman sitting right there, my friend and colleague Bolaji Campbell. We've worked for 2 years to bring him here to Knoxville and to UT, and it's paid off. And so he's like the center of this process. Also, the exhibition that we have upstairs, that I hope that you've seen or you will see. On Yoruba art, past and present. It's just wonderful that the KMA agreed to bring this exhibition in. Now, Africa is a huge continent, more than 50 countries, more than 2,000 ethnic groups. Why the Yoruba? Well, let me give you some very quick reasons. They may be too modest to tell you why, but certainly the Yoruba, one of the most well-known and largest ethnic groups in Africa. And their art is amongst the most revered and respected and documented around the world. And not only that, but their artistic traditions, which are so strong and so varied, persist today, not just in Africa, but also in the New World. There have been I would like to point very quickly to a couple of consequences of the focus on the Yoruba here tonight and with the exhibition. Those of you who have heard the creation story that the Yoruba tell about how the world was founded at Ile-Ife, which most of these speakers have either taught there or are from there, so that's significant, that the world was created at this town in Nigeria known as Ile-Ife. But, ladies and gentlemen, I have news for you. The center of the world has temporarily shifted to Knoxville, East Tennessee. The duration of this week. There's also, I think, been a second consequence that my having brought all these academic kings in has purportedly turned me into something of a kingmaker. Is that not right, Deli? What was the word for the A full budget. All right. So I found myself with a temporary newspaper. So now, just a quick word about how the format of the symposium looks. Nobody's giving any speeches or papers. Our speakers have been primed to speak to a general audience, and they are well skilled at this, and it's going to be a free and spirited flow of ideas, exchange of information, and questions from you, please. So that is how we've envisaged it, and we know it will work. So that's why we have so many people up here, and those who try to monopolize the microphone will get into trouble. So please, we want as many people to speak as we heard as possible. Don't forget tomorrow, I've all got a copy of the program. We've got two wonderful symposia tomorrow, one in the morning, the religious and cultural significance of African art, and then the afternoon, what promises to be hot and controversial. I've already heard them talking politics a lot about the political and social significance of African art. And it doesn't end there. Balaji Campbell will be giving a lecture on Tuesday, as you can see, in the art department, and also next Saturday he's giving a guided gallery tour of the exhibition. And now several classes have already benefited from his tour of the pieces, and I strongly encourage you to avail yourself of that, because he is an excellent tour guide. I will hand over the microphone to Professor Oyelera, who will do an invocation in Yoruba using kola nut, which is traditional to the Yoruba, and then I will hand over to our moderator. Thank you very much.
In the Yoruba law, there are 3 plants that should be specially honored. The first is the pepper, we call ata, because when you have the sniffles, with the pepper, you blow gently into your nostrils, which makes you sneeze and get rid of the viruses. The second one is the cotton tree. Because without the cotton tree, the human animal will be in its naked beauty. Some, like the monkey, some, like the gorilla, some will look the same with all kinds of carbuncles, but because of the cotton tree, our beauty is enhanced. The third one that Yoruba honor highly is the kola nut. The kola nut is the entity that we use to access the power, the life forces in everything. It is the one we use to ward off death, that we will use to ward off disease, that we use to invoke the power to enhance our good fortune. So, this evening, only obìnrin bẹ́kú, obìnrin báwọn, obìnrin bẹ ọmọ aráyé àmójúgbé ṣe, mojúbà ọwọ́, mojúbà ẹ̀sẹ̀, mojúbà àyàmàkótó lórí kò tí ò ro, mojúbà ọmọdé, mojúbà àgbà, ilẹ̀ ọ̀gẹ́rẹ́ àkọ́kọ́ yọrí wọ́n sì mú ajẹ́ báyìí o. Wọ́n ní ìjọ tí ebi bá ń pòkùn ká má rìn ìjọ náà. Ìwọ ẹ̀yin aláṣẹkù àwọn aláṣẹ púpọ̀ ní Amẹ́ríkà, àwọn tí wọ́n bá lẹ̀ ṣọ̀ rẹ̀ kó tó di pé àwọn àrè tó dé, àwọn àrè ìbáṣọ ìbò ìbáṣe àwọn tí wọ́n ń bá ọ̀run nílà ran tán mú bá tán, òdúdú tí dúró mèrè oníjọ́ ònílà, àwọn Yorùbá náà bá tán àtàwọn wa àjùbà kí ewé amúnimúyè kó má múyè wà lálẹ́ yìí o. Àṣẹ yóò ti pilẹ̀ náà bí a ṣe máa ṣe lọ, yóò tegbò yóò pẹ̀ka, kò ní tàkókóró, kò ní tegùn, iṣu ńláńlá ló máa ta, bó bá sì tegùn egun náà yóò di tún ńlá agbára Ọlọ́run. Ẹ̀yin tí ẹ ti òkèrè wá, wọ́n ní ìkọ́ kì í kọ́ ejò lẹ́sẹ̀, ẹyẹ kì í sì fò kòkòrò sọ́gi, bẹ́ẹ̀ ṣe ń lọ lé ẹ̀bàgẹ́ láyọ̀, àwọn àjẹ ìbílẹ̀ wọn ní pẹ̀lú. Ẹ̀yin tí ẹ jẹ́ bí àlejò tẹ wà níbí, ẹ̀ní bá ń rìn o, àrùn tọ́pẹ́ ẹ̀ní gbóná, wọ́n fẹ́ bá gbóná kò ní dalẹ̀ lórí àdúró yìí gbóná kalẹ̀ ààrẹ alẹ́ ni wọ́n ní péré olóńgbò yóò máa jẹ́ o. There are two types of kola nut. The one I have with me had 4 cartilages. If I break it, you will see that it had 4 pieces. That's 5. Which is maybe good. There are some that are only 2. The ones that have 2 are called kola nitida. They're very acidic. And in the Yoruba law, that type is very dead. You cannot use them to access the life forces. The concept of Yoruba, the Yoruba believes that we all are part of the same tributary of a central life force that flows inexorably in the world, as you speak, in the setting sun, in the living things, and the non-living things. We are just tributaries of that life force. That life force we can chase out through the use of this kola nut with more than 2 cartilages. The one with 2 cartilages are very dead. This one are not dead. We know, the Yoruba people know how to access this life force, to use it to access life force in other things. So, for all the ancestors that have gone to, those who knew this land before you all visitors came, so we start. Obignon. Because we don't say destiny, all the success will attend your proceedings here.
Well, I just feel that I should translate the earlier invocation in which Professor Ilarno paid homage to the earth, the extensive one that unites humanity across cultures and across continents, and is wishing that may we all tread peacefully on this earth, and may all our undertakings be successful, and may the kola nut deflect and repel all evil forces, so that all our deliberations may be positive. And that is the implication of this early invocation to the earth that preceded us in this world and will also survive us. But may we live long on it. May we tread long on it. And leave behind successors to continue the human spirit. So, over to you.
If you like, before you go, you can take a piece of this for all the blessings to follow you home.
Well, I have been wondering ever since Dr. Hackett phoned me, and I impulsively accepted the invitation to moderate this distinguished panel. And every day since then, I have wondered if I had lost my mind. The last hour has shown me, or the last few minutes has shown me that I had not. I have been interested in Yoruba culture and in the culture of various parts of Africa since I was about 12 years old. This interest was particularly intensified when I began working on a novel that may someday be finished, I'm not sure. But it will be a novel about our South. And my son, who had known a great deal about Yoruba art, asked me, he said, now you are going to include the different arts of different people who make up our culture here. And I said, well, of course. So then he began to bring me books, the most recent one of which is this one. And in these pages, I found a picture of the mother. I just will call them by their first names because I don't want to mispronounce their others. Roland, one of our really distinguished guests here, has a picture of his mother that is a wonderful picture in this book. But in addition to that, I had been reading about the kola nuts. I know all of the deities, the different deities there. And yet, in the last few minutes, I've learned more about it than I had with all the reading. There's nothing about a person sitting next to you and giving a kind of an approval or a disapproval motion there or a memento when someone gives the invocation. And I think that this is just an amazing moment to be. I can tell you that when I first came to Newport, and even 15 years ago, it would never have occurred to me that we could have had an occasion like this. And I think this makes us international in the best sense of the word. Not just international that companies come here, but that cultures come here, and that we share. As Ralph Norman said, that art is not separate. Art is politics, as one of our distinguished guests knows, who is a satirist and a cartoonist. And it is not only history, but it is the present. As Faulkner said, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. And the past is right here with us tonight of a culture about which we have known far too little. So as I looked through these books and became acquainted, it's wonderful to become acquainted in books, but there's nothing like becoming acquainted in person. And I am privileged to be here. And I really don't expect to say one other word except nudge somebody and say, answer that question, because they know far more than I do. But I wanted to quote two sentences that came from the conclusion of this book on the Yoruba. The Yoruba describe their culture as a river that is never at rest. The metaphor is apt, for it conveys the Yoruba sense of continuous change, of life is caught up within swift-moving currents that can run deeply and quietly or are turbulent and overpowering. It is not an image that implies a sense of fate and helplessness. On the contrary, as we have seen, the Yoruba have a lively sense of the individual's obligation to make life meaningful by drawing upon one's own creative capacities and acknowledging, that is, sacrificing to those powers that pervade the universe of one's experience. It is through the imaginative creations of the artist that the persons see themselves and their world anew and are empowered to respond creatively to the world in which they live. So this is individualism at its very highest peak, because the individual is the one that experiences its art, and it is also community as its richest experience, because then he or she, and the importance of women in Yoruba art is very interesting, and I hope that will be addressed tonight, and they become part of the community. So this is the river that never rests, and I will let you ask the questions, and I will let them answer, and I will become educated. Yes.
Well, before, I just want to continue where Professor Oyelaro left off. You know, he talked about the enhancing aspect of cotton, because cotton is the raw material for fabric, and we know the relationship between art and the fabric of life. So in many African cultures, art not only enhances, but also reinforces life. So art and life are inseparable. And in many African cultures, in fact, it is because the entire society is the museum, is the gallery, unlike lately when art has been separated from where constitutes refinements of raw material. So we begin to see in the language of African art an orchestration of form to reflect specific visions of the human spirit in particular societies. As a result, we have a kind of selective realism in the imagery. If you look at a typical African art form figure, you discover that the head, is larger than the rest of the body. And this reflects the importance of the head. In real life, it is the seat of the brain, the eyes, the nose. In fact, without the head, no human being will be. It is easy if somebody is injured, you can attempt to revive a body with the head intact. But once the body loses the head, finito. You forget it. So it is when we understand the language, the philosophy behind the artistic creation in Africa that we can begin to access the message. The form is crucial in African art because it projects a language, an attitude, a perspective, and a vision of life in a given African community. Whether in dress itself has a respective minimum in terms of what the individual puts on the body. And again, you look at the given society, you see that the dresses unite the entire society, constituting the tie that binds. So begin to see again aspects of art that unite society, just as the artist himself tries to unite within the image, different parts to create a whole. So we have the enhancing aspect, the aesthetic, then we have the communicative aspect, we have the religious aspect, but for now we want to emphasize the aesthetic aspect because in many of the literature there is this assumption that there was no art in traditional Africa. That is false. The language, it may not be art in the Western conception of it, but a close examination of the different languages of Africa will reveal concepts like in Yoruba, honor. Honor means art, means design, be fabricated. Among the leather, art or sculpture is bintingwa. Bintingwa is the integrated. Among the jaw, it is Oru, Fubara, and that is called the forehead of the spirit, the name of the spirit. What defines a phenomenon? And before I leave on, I want to hand over to my colleagues. Art has to do with that creative spirit in nature. In fact, in Yoruba tradition, the human image was fabricated by an artist deity. So we are the masterpiece of creation. And in the arts, this creative spirit within the human frame now manifests in different artistic creations, be it sculpture, architecture, painting, and so on and so forth. So the dimensions of art in Africa are much deeper than had been acknowledged. And originally it was called primitive. But as we know more, we become educated. What was primitive yesterday is now the source of modern art. Evidently, African art was ahead of its time. I'm just beginning to appreciate it. Let me hand over to our colleagues.
Yes, I think it would be interesting to have some of the others address this.
Well, why don't we get the
audience? This just to set the...
All right. All right. Are there questions then from the audience that have been inspired by the statement here?
Yeah, is someone there?
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question of my dear friend Bolaji,
Yes.
who has been an artist in residence at the University of Tennessee for the last couple months, to comment upon the difference between his own education at Ife as an art student and what he has seen of the art students at the University of Tennessee in terms of their experience and their education, to comment on similarities and differences between those two.
Well, I hope that's not an embarrassing question for him, but we would like to have you answer that.
Well, why not?
Absolutely.
I also had similar exposure, just like UT students who were grounded in art theories, Western art form of education. But that was at my undergraduate level. And the curriculum in IFE, particularly at the graduate level.
Can you speak a little louder?
Okay. Okay. The curriculum in IFE at the postgraduate level is grounded in Yoruba philosophy, in Yoruba culture. And for the first time, I began to experience Yoruba sensibility, Yoruba ideas, and this was quite fascinating to me. So I became more interested. I began to research into Yoruba shrine paintings, and I became interested in the aesthetics of Yoruba art. Despite the fact that some of the pioneering scholars of African art erroneously believed that there was no painting tradition in Africa or even in Yoruba land. And women have been doing this for several generations, despite the fact that this might not even be regarded as an art form. For me, this was a new experience that indeed Yoruba women have been painting for several generations. And I initially, of course, received training in the Western forms of Izu painting, and I was led to believe there was nothing, in my own tradition. But I was happy, of course, when I discovered that there was something in my tradition, and some of my colleagues here, co-speakers, who were my professors then, were actually the ones that guided my hand, as it were, my path to discovering the new experience. And I did not merely stop at attempting to know, this new, as it were, form of painting to me, but I began to borrow elements, borrow ideas from what the women were doing, even into my own art. Interestingly, of course, when I came here to Knoxville, I am not totally unfamiliar with, Western forms of painting. And what I have seen in the last couple of weeks has not in any way changed my stereotypic nature, perspective of Western painting here. But curiously, I have been able to observe that indeed there are similarities in many ways, in terms of ideas, in terms of elements that might be borrowed across cultures. And the use of color, to me, is not entirely different from the way Africans use color. Likely because the Western exposure I had taught me that for the painter there are merely three colors, the primary colors, and that all the other colors of the spectrum could be generated from this. And in my own research, of course, I also learned that there are three primary, Yoruba primary colors. And I can see a kind of a meeting point between these two traditions. But it might be a little wrong, it might be a little uncomfortable for me to believe or to subscribe to the notion that because Yoruba or African conception of color is different from the Western, and I've had people say that Africans work in monochrome, but this is slightly different. It's completely different from our own perspective, in the sense that we do not regard the color groups that Africans work with as monochromatic color sensibilities. On the other hand, we think, or have realized that the perception of color in the West is perhaps monochromatic. The African is polychromatic, in the sense that it embraces a range of colors, and it is a reflection of the Yoruba ability to be accommodative, to group things, to see the world from multi-dimensional perspective, rather than being categorized, in straight jacket into compartments, as it were. I don't want to take too much of the time. I want the other speakers to also, and I also want a reaction from the audience.
Thank you very much. There's another question just there, and for whom is it?
I'm Kathy Bostad, and head of the philosophy department. It seems to me that in the West we make a rather strict distinction between art, design, and crafts. And I wonder if this is perhaps obstructing our appreciation of African art.
I don't know if it obstructs the appreciation, but I can talk a little bit about where I believe that comes from, and I believe it comes from Newtonian physics, where you get into the atomization of the world, reducing things to its lowest common denominator or its smallest element, or to discrete particles. Instead of looking at how things relate, we begin to look at how we can separate and find distinctions between, and that does interfere with certain understandings. I know when I started studying African art, I had to deal with religion, I had to deal with history, with art history, I had to deal with language, and so I was taking place in the New World as people go, not multicultural, multidisciplinary approach. And in another matter, I was talking to Sokwe, and he talked about my inability to act in a certain situation, and he said it was like an elephant had died and no one in the village had a knife. And I love that, but it also...
You begin to see that is an intentional, pejorative abuse of the art. by referring to some as crafty or craft or design. Those are teleological. Art is not necessarily teleological. It's an expression representing life. And people who want to be pejorative at this call it crafty because they are assigned to it some teleology that is not necessarily complementary to their own experience. And this building, never mind whether it appeals to anybody, if you call it a design, somebody has something in it for it. And I said linguists are fools, that's why I made this comment.
I just wanted to add one or two points to that. The first is that even in this country, I guess in the West, for a long time, in fact, it's only recently that anything that women do was called art. It was called craft. And what men did was art. So, in a way, it tells us something about what's going on here. And the problem actually goes a little bit deeper, because I want us to remember that there was a time that African art was not seen, it wasn't even considered art at all. It was non-art. And it was only at the turn of the, maybe around the turn of the century, that it was elevated to the status of what we call in art history ethnographica curiosa, that is, ethnographical curiosity. And later on, it got elevated even further, thanks to Picasso and so on, and all the other people trying to contrast classical Western art with non-Western art. It got elevated to what we call primitive art, even further. And then, of course, today it is only becoming, gradually scholars are beginning to admit the scholars of African art into the gatherings of society or organizations of, say, the College Art Association, because they were never really considered art forms. Now, these observations lead us to one thing, or two. One, the fact that there is the suggestion of class here, of power. Who is calling the shots here? Who is saying that something is art, or who is saying that something is craft? And another thing is that we must, sometimes we like to be objective, and we think we're objective, but we have to think of the level, of the limits of objectivity, even in science. The limits of objectivity here has to be. And then we must also remember that the people whose art we're considering, or whose art we study, are people who have not only been colonized, but they fall on the, the notion, the level of art is certainly determined in part, or in fact more than in part, by the Western imperialistic, if you like, motives of the people who are doing this. So it will not be proper, it's really not quote-unquote logical to call the art of the oppressors, of the oppressed, to bring it up to the level of the oppressors. And so there is a kind of this type of thing there. Finally, I like to say that the art
form that we find when we start looking at this, we find that there is usually this preoccupation with compartmentalization, trying to categorize, trying to over-limit or to over-define, which is good in itself. But sometimes we can fall into the category of an either-or, this dichotomy thing, which always is the greatest problem we experience in the study of African art. Up to recent times, there have been publications that contrast what we call classicism and primitivism, the two phases of art history. What sometimes is very difficult, the charge, it's very difficult for people to understand, but it's kind of easy to swallow because, after all, these people are producing what they have been producing year after year. They're doing the same thing. People don't see even any change in posture. They do not have any, they don't have any tendency to revere the integrity of man's body. They do not even have any, they don't even consider aesthetics as part of their work, or it is even totally absent in the arts of these people. So there are problems that come up here. But it's very interesting that at the beginning of the century, starting from 1904, 1905, 6, 7, 8, that the way African art worked itself back into the international art scene, had to be through Picasso, Braque, Modigliani, Matisse, and so on, who were indeed using African art as a catalyst and also as a kind of sanction for their own revolutionary goals. And so it came in by default into art as a way, because these people were clearly departing from their Greco-classical traditions, which of course had been the line that had been going on before. It's a kind of a detour. So there are, here again we fall into the problem of trying to compare and contrast, because, but when Picasso's work, Demoiselle d'Avignon, for example, came up, nobody was talking about proportion. Nobody was talking about inaccurate representation of the human figure. Nobody was talking of rationality or irrationality or that sort of thing. So these problems are there, but it was hailed as a kind of a new way of looking at that time. What I see as the basis of our problem is basically that of cross-cultural translation. In other words, when we are viewing the art of other peoples, we have to stop for a while and find out exactly whether indeed what we are saying actually applies, or whether what we're saying actually applies, we have to see the distinction between what I call ideal and performance. What we think is happening distinct from what is really happening. And that's, again, a very fine distinction. That means we have to probe the thought systems that go behind these things. I think there are problems here which we can't all address tonight, but suffice it to say that this is only the beginning of such things, and the work, the kind of work that awaits historians, really phenomenal. It's not, we're just beginning actually to look at them. Sorry.
Jump in here?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Is it working? Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
What I
would want us to look at also, this is a follow-up to what he has just said, is the role of culture. The question is, who determines what art is? What is art? And my suspicion is that culture plays a very major role in the process whereby an object becomes transformed into an artwork. I speak up there, I had been told on our way down here, shh, don't go in yet. And I went up there and looked at the exhibit for the first time. And what I saw was something to the effect, don't touch, don't just get near. And I said, gee, this is what? This is supposed to be African art or Yoruba art, to be very specific. The culture has reconstructed what Yoruba art now has to be here. So the second thing here is contextualization. We need to look at the context. There's no way that you have any of the things up here that I'm being forbidden to touch among the Yoruba that people are not going to carry and touch and that kind of stuff. And if we would ponder for a moment the kind of culture that we have this side of the aisle, particularly the culture of the museum, and the keynote speaker, of the person who works on that, did say that the history of museums, development of museums in the Western world is less than 200 years old, and I do agree with that. But now we've gotten to a point where we have cultivated the habit of treating these objects as much more precious than human beings. Shh, don't speak. When you go to the museum, the way we pretend that we're going to wake them up, you don't even have to, you cannot chew anything. Don't even think about chewing. It's part of the culture. And within the home base, and I want you for a moment to think about yourself as the unfortunate object, the Aruba that's upstairs, for example, that has been captured, colonized, transported overseas, and brought to this environment where you are now alone in a prison, and in that glass case, and somebody comes and takes some labels there, and you wonder, what is this guy doing? And you look around, you don't even know there are no neighbors, and they can't hear you. And most important of all, you see yourself as a very naked kind of entity. Where are all the people? And that brings us to the notion of decapitation. Every art object or so-called art object that we find here, to a large extent, has suffered some degree of humiliation. He's been decapitated. There is no way you see most of these things outside if they are meant to be seen, that is by women. And that's the other thing. Most of these things are not supposed to be seen, some of them are by women. And now women do all sorts of things and other than touch them. Where they are meant to be outside, you see everybody really running, and it's not a thing that you stand in one particular spot to appreciate. Why? Because it is used in the context. Maybe once in a while, a whole week is set aside, and we come to the issue of aesthetics. Who determines what is aesthetics? And I know that there are people here who have worked very seriously on that and continue to work on that. I think it's very important for us to also realize that if we ask the wrong set of questions, we're going to get the wrong set of answers. And so when we come back with paradigms, there are 18 criteria of aesthetics, sometimes it's difficult for us to say you can categorize these things into sets of aesthetic criteria. So it's very important for us to see the interrelationship of the art, that in almost every object that qualifies to be used within the context up here if it were to be the mother culture, you're going to have poetry, you're going to have music, you're going to have dance, you're going to have all costumes, drumming, all of these things. There is the energy, and whoever is the carrier becomes the vessel, possessed, transformed. And I want us to just give a thought to the impact of culture, and to also spare a thought sometimes to sympathize with those objects upstairs that we have in prison.
I would like to add that one of the problems we have here is that we usually look at the end product and not the creative process when we talk about art and the craft. Everybody who transforms materials from the raw to the finished deals with design, deals with principles and elements of design, and it does not matter whether the person is doing ceramics, whether the person is doing sculpture, whether he's doing architecture or any other form. What matters is the way in which the artist is able to control his material, and the skill with which that artist moves that material from the basic to the finished. And that transformation is not simply an abstraction. It is something that informs the life of the artist himself. As the artist transforms the material also transforms the artist. It is a two-way process. But when somebody now comes from the outside and looks at the object and does not know how this object has come to become what it is, when there is that kind of distance between the artist and the critic is able to say all kinds of things about these materials that might not really be applicable to this material in actual life. One of the things that African art does, and it has been said here again by some of the speakers, is the way in which it allows us in the present to link with our past, and also to be able to think about our future, in the sense that I go into the museum. In fact, there is this exhibition now, African art past and present, Yoruba art past and present, and you see what the Yoruba artists used to do maybe in the last century, and look at what the artists are doing now, and you see lots of continuities. You see changes, but you see lots of continuity. And then you wonder why some of these art objects used to be referred to as crafts in the past, or primitive in the past, whereas the artists, the contemporary artists now, are more or less doing the same thing, maybe with the use of new materials, sometimes with the use of new methods. But basically, there is still the continuity in the tradition of working with elements and principles of design. So the kind of distance that the critic sees, the kind of what the critic talks about when he talks about art and craft, simply shows that they are very alienated from the creative process.
I just want to add a sentence before we entertain questions. Just to take a line from the last speaker, it seems that much of the emphasis today is on the product. There is an attempt to ignore the process. In traditional Africa, the process of creation was an act and a gesture. For instance, among the Igbo, there is the concept of Mbari. Mbari
is a sculptural process. It's a monument dedicated to the earth goddess. The very act of creating this monument is more important than the final product. So we see a dynamic process at work here. Because the very act, the very process of creating the Mbari is a sacrifice to the earth goddess. The Mbari may take about 2 or 3 years to create, during which there is a lot of prayer, dances, and so on and so forth. But no sooner is this monument that has taken 2 or more years to do is completed, then it is abandoned. So you see a lot of creative energy being expended on this monument, expressing different aspects of life, the human aspiration. So people see Mbari as dance, as prayer, as invocation, made visible. Then after about a week or 2, when there's a formal opening of what has taken 3 or 4 years to create, then after some time it is abandoned and left to perish. Because the very process of creating it is the human gesture in appreciation of the need to recreate in order to stimulate the procreative process in nature. It's when the Mbari disintegrates that the community has the opportunity to start all over again. So the dialogue between the human and nature, between culture and nature, is reflected in this attempt to keep into motion the process of existing, and existence itself, is attended by death and rebirth. Life dies, another life is born. So we see this cyclical process in the artistic, in the dynamics of creating the object itself. Of course, today people try to preserve the Mbari, whereas before it is a continuous process. It's when it is destroyed that another is created to reflect the dynamics of the present. Although in the process of creating, you incorporate past, elements of the past, as well as what is going on in the present, and also speculate about the future. So we see in African art not just the descriptive, something created for its own sake, but for specific ends that relate to the existential process, in an attempt to sustain the human spirit. And this creative dimension of art has been very important in traditional Africa and continues in the works of the contemporary artists. Okay,
these comments, I'm sure they must have inspired some questions from, yes, one over here.
I just wanted to explain
The cartoon.
No.
They say the cartoon at the back of they want to explain the cartoon.
And there is always something conscious in the work that people are bringing to the surface. And when that disconnection took place with African artists, as I talked about, and obviously with African American artists, there were certain things that had to be recovered, to be excavated, to be resurrected consciously. Once they become understood and internalized, then the aesthetic that results is in fact the culture being created as it is creating the artist, as Ocasio talked about. And my model for explaining this is from Moyo Okedeji. He, in his dissertation, talked about Yoruba culture metaphorically being represented as a gourd, and the slave trade being the shattering or dismembering of that gourd, and the conscious effort as being a re-membering of that gourd. And that has been a process, a dialogue that has been going on for over 100 years. We've had people going from the Americas back to Sierra Leone during the slave trade. We've had Pan-Africanist conferences, from the Chicago conference in 1893 that Henry Tanner spoke at, to Pan-Africanist conferences in 1900. Du Bois organized some after World War I, to this pilgrimage back and forth. So now there's a dialogue, and you can begin to see some of the same issues played out in Yoruba work today that are being played out in African American, Caribbean, South American expression today. There's a continuity, a global continuity, that is, I find exciting.
I'm delighted that the word expression came into this coming just now. In the 1960s, an American psychologist wrote a book about why Pele children could not learn mathematics. Now, Pele people are a group in West Africa, and apparently it was impossible for them to be taught mathematics. In 1989, a book was published in the U.S. as to why African American children could not learn mathematics, and the book is titled "Twice as Less." Now, if that expression would be said in the mainstream English, it would be half as much. Now, but you see, the perception that looks at one entity that says that thing is twice as less as this, and another that says it's half as much, they are talking about the same thing. But the author, like many teachers of African American children, do not understand twice as less, and therefore anybody says that cannot possibly learn. And I'm saying this to say this, that the perception that says twice as less is found on both sides of the Atlantic. It is not a conscious recreation of the African American children. I'm not saying that artists are not conscious creators, in the process. But you see, it appears to me, when I look at some of the creative works of so-called outsider art in the U.S., I'm astounded at what I call a kind of false memory, that informs. You can see this almost, you work in the work of Hobby and others. They're there. So what I'm saying is, before Escovitch, they said if Africans came in the slave ship, they brought nothing. Therefore, they couldn't, everything is lost. But remember that those who were brought were, some of them are members of the intelligentsia who already knew the culture, and therefore recreated certain things using materials they found here. And the tradition continued. So if artists if art is informed by the culture, by upbringing, by socialization through institutions, it's not surprising then that you see some of this degeneration, whether conscious or not.
Another question? Yes.
I don't know if I was asked a question, but I think the question may be large from observations. I collect art. But I can only collect art of those that I know, because I have to relate to that art on that level for me to connect. The realization of that came to me just now because I was also considering certain things that go with what Moyo and Professor Laurent talked about. The question of what is art in the Yoruba sense. Is it the process of it, or is it the end product? I was thinking, I don't visit museums. because I really can't relate to object injustice. I can't. I don't do it. I lived in Israel for 20 years. They have a big museum out there, fantastic museum. I've been there twice to take Americans there when they visit. You want to see this? But I can't relate. But then I thought about it. I said, but you collect it. What's happening out there? Then I realized, for something strange, that actually I only collect out of those I know. Now, what would you suggest should be done if we want to show our art and have it have meaning to people who may not even know the art? What do we do to create a museum of African art that will present African art the way Africans understand it? How would you design such a museum? I don't know if you can do that.
Do you have an answer to that? Good.
I had an idea going in the same direction. Before I was interested at all in African art, I was interested in...
Can you speak a little louder so everyone can...
My husband and I were interested in Mexican art. And the Mexican culture is very rich with lots of art objects and things from everyday life that are made by hand, that are made beautifully, that are part of the culture of each group that lives there. And Covarrubias is a very well-known person who brought to the people of Mexico themselves what their culture was about, because they too had been conquered or visited by outsiders. And many of the groups there didn't understand or appreciate the variety and texture and beauty of the things that the indigenous peoples there created. So in Mexico City, he erected this museum, which is called an anthropological museum, but in fact, it preserves for the peoples of the various areas of all of Mexico what their culture is about, what it has been about, and what parts of it continue to be. Now, it's without sound and without some things that new technology could bring to enliven that museum. So it's still very static, but it doesn't decontextualize the pieces from the culture. It retains it within each group, and people are shown there in the costume from the area that they are from, and all the artifacts that are around them that are used in various processes. So it's like little vignettes from various parts of Mexico, and I think it's perhaps the most meaningful museum of any kind because it has that.
I think it would be interesting to know from these gentlemen, where are the best collections? Where are the best Yoruba art? Where is it to be found?
Of course, most of them were taken out. After the country, many of them in Europe, in the
like
U.S.
Elgin marbles. And
Elgin marbles, the Greek something.
That's right.
Yes, there are still some left behind. In
yes.
Yes. Yes.
The Victorian Albert has quite a lot of art that is from many different the places from which they have taken people would like to come back. Perhaps they're also very originally art to where they came from. One of the questions I wanted to ask was not wanting any prescriptive ideas on where art should be shown and how it ought to be shown. Perhaps part of the problem with the exhibition of African art, which I felt definitely going around upstairs, was that everything the headdresses was static. I think it loses a lot of its aesthetics just sitting there static. I think there ought to be some sort of idea that you shouldn't show this unless it's in some sort of motion, unless you can make some effort to show it, sort of embracing the whole context that it would be shown within it, wherever it's in.
Actually, that problem has been solved in other museums. Along with displays, you have videos showing these works in context. We have to contend with the realities of display, and we're also talking of process. That is time. We are contending with time. And any appreciation of art must be in retrospect, because the work has left the studio of the artist. When the artist was working on this, so many things were going on in his mind. We can never reconstruct the very process, the very rhythm of, say, creating the work of a Jackson Pollock, because the emotion, the process was still part, is part of the creation. If we translate this into the African art context, we begin to see the problem faced by the art historian and by the museum curator, who has to educate others about art from other cultures. If left in those cultures, would not be accessible. If we have to display art in the original context, we'll have to ship everybody to Africa to see masks in display. So what museums are doing now is a compromise to see how we can display the object and at the same time show through video, film photographs of some of these works in context. I'm not saying that is the ideal, but we just have to look for ways of dealing with the realities of a global culture. We are now talking of globalization, trying to educate the world about the cultures of its constituent parts. And this requires new logistics. So at times I am critical of some of these displays. But when I'm told to advise, because I've advised so many museums, what do we do? You don't have to hang a mask on the wall. A mask is to be seen in motion. Yet, the mask is there. What do we do? Then why can't you show the mask in use, in display? You have a small kiosk somewhere showing the same mask on the wall in action, or a similar mask. So this is the type of compromise we can do. If works of art are taken out of context, I'm not saying that I approve of appropriation, yet we have to look for ways and means of bridging the gap between source of the original object and where the object is today. Some of these things were often captured from the original owners. Others were sold voluntarily by their owners. So we have to take, there are so many variables at work here. So we just have to take each problem on some merit and look for solutions. Because one cannot say, this is the way to display African art. Every scholar has his own perspective. And then all we can do is to compromise, look for a way of...
You can't make that river run back.
But yeah, it's a process, something that goes on.
The river has to work on,
and
but you can gather along the way.
Yeah.
You can gather along the way. There was a woman back there had, yes. You.
The man.
Well, there was, I thought there was a woman back from you, but okay, go ahead.
And I hope I will ask it in a brief way instead of a long way. What I would like to know is if someone could talk a little bit about the current conditions of artistic production in Nigeria and the current conditions of production of Yoruba art. And I can think of a lot of different ways that question can be interpreted. The most immediate one has to do with whether there is state intervention in the production of art in Nigeria given the current situation of the government in Nigeria, and what effect that has on what other than that, I was thinking in terms of questions that market related to what kind of international and what kind of national and local networks artists produce for, but that gets way too long. So
very short way of answering that question, or attempting to answer it, is to say that yes, there is a very vibrant culture of artistic production going on in Nigeria today that defies the very gloomy political and economic situation there. And this cuts across board. You find at one level, for example, the likes of Lamidi Fakeye, Dejo Fakeye, the Biti Fakeye, and all the Fakeyes are still producing. Of course, we have to acknowledge that the society also is in a flux. The second level is the level of what has been termed popular art. Science painting and art. Frank McQueen has called that airport art. It's a very vibrant area. If you have to survive in Nigeria, you find that it doesn't matter whether you call it airport art or street art, all you need is the money. The third level is the level of what here we might call high art, the art that's meant for museums. That really brings to mind the words of Paul Cézanne. And that is the kind of thing that you find here in Muyo and Bolaji and people like me would ordinarily aspire to do. Muyo was saying less than 24 hours ago that he is very reluctant to part with his work because, again, we come back to the creative process. But the thing also is that if you go to Lagos today, Lagos is today the capital of Nigeria, you find that hardly would a week run by without you having a major, a show, whether you call it major or not. The artists are sure to make as much noise, as much publicity, information available as is necessary. And there is, in fact, now a culture of opening, of formal openings of exhibitions where you bring in the chairman, managing director, chief alaji, Dr. ABC, and you bring all those beer manufacturers and all of those the money people, and bear in mind that that also was a time when SAP, what is known as Structural Adjustment Program, hit the country. And the fallout of that is that overnight, in the times of Babangida, we had what has in terms of deregulation. That's the new economic thing that people have had to grapple with. Simply put, it means that you can't go out and establish your own bank. And there were people who availed themselves of that opportunity. It doesn't matter whether that bank is the only bank in Nigeria. And there was a fact that came on. Everybody now became something PLC. It's no longer limited. It is public liability. And they indeed became liabilities eventually. Because now I have friends who are in jail because they had mismanaged, millions of naira as bank managing directors. But that was a time that it became very fashionable because you had the money to construct very lavish gates to your home and to make sure that you decorate your living room with all sorts of artwork. And there were people who, because they've been out of colleges and had no, employment was something very difficult, they went into the studio. So there is, to come back to that question, unquestionably, a lot of activities going on today that really would have to be investigated because they defy the economic kind of gloom that that country is experiencing.
If I may comment about the issue of collection, just a small comment, and that is that art cannot be collected or displayed. Only objects are collected and displayed. Art remains with the artist. And that is why you cannot take African art out of Africa. It remains in Africa. And the objects that you see there are good to be there. They are fine where they are because they are actually historical records of the kind of relationships that have occurred between the North and the South. And they are very, very important because without these records, you cannot substantiate the way in which the exploitation of the South has taken place. They are evidences of the pillage of Africa, and they are best left here as evidences, like blood in the hand of a killer.
Well, do we have another question, or should we leave it there?
As a mother of
I'd like to follow up on this question of the production of art in Nigeria today, and ask any of the panelists if they're concerned about the influence of Western patronage on Nigerian artists. It's often been the case that colonialists change the art that they collect and the culture they collect. Is this an issue for any of you?
Yes, you have the microphone already.
Go ahead,
please.
Go ahead.
Please.
I wouldn't see that as any more of an issue as the collection of French Impressionists by English aristocrats.
Actually, I would say that patronage is central to artistic production. If there is no viable patronage, the artist would be less productive throughout the history of art. In fact, the Renaissance is a typical example. We discover that the Medici family were instrumental to the flowering of the arts in Florence. And similarly in Africa, the priesthood, for instance, of Yoruba religion, as well as the laity, they both constitute two sides of the same coin, providing the artist the clientele that nurtured creativity. If you don't have patronage, the artist will go hungry. And not only that, they are likely to. So patronage is central.
Could we just have one other?
Could I address that? I want a question, a follow-up question. How do you deal with the person sitting next to you?
You mean the... Yeah, he's an artist.
Yes, he will produce, but you have to split his work to others.
You mean to...
He doesn't want this.
No, of course. In fact, that one is the answer is there. He's producing and doesn't want to part with his work because he's a full-time teacher. When you depend on your art, you have to survive. You have to sell to survive. You will discover that the most creative of the artists are those who don't sell their works, but they depend on something else. If some of them are born...
That's why the notion of patronage is very dangerous. When the British sacked Benin, what did they do? They went to the palace and removed all the objects. Obviously, this was created by certain people. They didn't create them for pay. So if you qualify to say in an economy where the new god of free market reigns, then patronage is essential.
Yeah, patronage
in a moneyed economy. Otherwise, you have cultures where the artist is the ward of the community. I mean, if you call that patronage, then that's fine. But when you say patronage in terms of paying and buying, I'm not sure that is not absolute truth.
Actually, when we talk of patronage, we should not translate patronage into exchange with the dollar. No, if I commission an artwork for religious worship, I'm still a patron. So we have to distinguish between patronage as somebody who commissions a work of art for a specific purpose. The artist doesn't just create and give these works away. Even in a community where trade was by barter, you traded your work in exchange for a service or for something else. Patronage is still essential for the artist. Otherwise, the artist will be creating for its own sake. And this is a philosophical question which you have to... You don't create just to keep in your house. It is used by your patron, whoever that may be, and whatever that patron pays is immaterial here.
And then Michael,
Yes, we have another question.
Okay.
I just want to make one quick comment on that question too. I think, in my opinion, it is dangerous to overestimate the influence of Europe on Africa and African culture. I don't think that Picasso stopped being Spanish because he was influenced by African art, and I don't think the reverse happens. So I think that's something that we have to watch for.
Good point. Yes, there was a young man over here who had a question.
I just wanted to say, regarding what Mario said, this is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Mario said he wants to part with, he's not ready to part with the object of his art. I think the point he made, the way I understood it, is that the very process, the experiences and values that go into the creative process, he will never part with that. That will stay with him. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because one of the points that was made earlier on is that in reference to Barry, for instance, that it's not necessarily the finished product that's the key factor, but that the process that goes into the creation of that finished product is the key factor, and that is often ignored.
Yes.
All right. The young woman back here. Well, there are two. Yes, you.
No, the first woman. Okay. First woman hasn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just, whilst she's next. I just thought of, I'm not sure if it's the Shanti or the Fanti, the Ghanaian flag makers. There was a very interesting BBC documentary about a year, 2 years ago in Britain that was talking about how the flag makers, how the art had been brought to Europe, how it was put on postcards, the whole thing became very popular, and the people that were buying this so-called artistic work didn't even know where it came from. And the young man that was making the documentary actually went back to Ghana to ask the artists, the so-called flag makers, what they thought about the fact that their art was being appreciated outside of Ghana. And one of the things that came out of this was that quite a lot of the flag makers were quite upset because the whole, it was a very secret, not so much secret, but it was something learned, and they discovered that because of this sort of new Western light of their art, that a lot of the young artists in the villages were selling art that they ought not to have sold, that were part of the community, and they were quite upset that their flags were being lost because of this need to make money, this need to serve the Western sort of desire of African art. I just wanted to look at the issue of not embracing patronage so much that we forget that this desire can also take away from the African community something that ought to stay within that community.
But there's a difference between patronage and commodification. Commodification is a commercialization. You know, there was traditional patronage and more recent contemporary dollar-oriented patronage. You know, the traditional artist had its own patron in the past. So it is when we commodify that we begin to see the input of the foreign elements. So you know that we should differentiate between the traditional patrons of the artist. So long as the artist had a patron locally, there's patronage. We cannot separate patronage from the artistic enterprise. But the level, the degree of patronage, when it turns into commodification, it becomes commercialization, mass production, tourism, then we begin to see another level of patronage.
We're very worried that the woman in the white shirt.
I hate to shift the topic. It's very exciting.
But I wanted to come back to what you said about the fact that some of the objects upstairs women would never see. Are women traditionally and today making art in rural culture, and what kind of lines are drawn between art that women make and art that men make?
Related.
I just wanted to add to that question about women. You've all talked about appropriation of art.
Can everyone hear her?
Yeah.
Good.
You've all talked about the appropriation of art and the separate humiliation of the art. And I also wanted to bring up the topic of women's art. What about the artwork that men are not supposed to see, that women do, especially the shrine painting, as I know a few of our speakers have written about, and how women are only researched by other men, so how their artwork might actually be misinterpreted or misunderstood.
Well, would you like to would someone else like to comment on that?
I don't want to be talking all the time, but I want to know. Yeah, you can know you are. Okay. Well, in these particular instances, in fact, there are two levels of artistic exposure. You have the esoteric and the exoteric. There is public art and there is private art. Public art is for the generality, for festivals. And then there are some private forms forbidden to both male and uninitiated male and female. And there are certain art forms. So it is not just that women are discriminated against. It all depends on the context of the work and the purpose for which it was created. Women created, women, in fact, there's some kind of gender differentiation in the arts. For instance, pottery is a female occupation. And doll making, wall painting is done by both sexes. But there are certain forms that are used in certain religious ceremonies, prohibited to everybody. So, and there are certain forms that are not to be touched by male and female. It all depends. Just as you have on the altar certain sacred symbols which nobody can touch but the priest. So it all depends on the work. And at times, certain works may be desacralized after it has fulfilled its function and thrown away. So it all depends. As we move into the complexity of African aesthetics, then we begin to see layers, different layers.
Well, I hate to mention it, but it's 10 minutes of 10, and we have certainly worked our panel. Let's have one more. Someone, you wanted to ask a question, didn't you? Didn't you have your hand up? Could you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah.
If we're talking about women's art, okay, you're talking about depends on what it is.
Yeah.
Okay? If a particular sacred shrine painting, if that style is then appropriated by another artist, a male artist, and used in his work, so how does that go with what you're saying? When you're saying, yeah, there really are defined lines. What do we do, or how do you feel about crossing those lines? What happens then? Are those women, and is their artwork suffering or being misrepresented, exploited?
Yeah. Actually, in fact, what we find is that works are consecrated before they are placed on the altar. That sacralizes them. At times, women buy images from the artist, which they will now give to the priest for specific ritual uses. Again, in fact, when we talk about the creative process in traditional Africa, certain art forms like sculpture in traditional Africa was the exclusive preserve of the male. In fact, pottery, there are certain figurative potteries could be made only by elderly women. And even African scholars have written about this. Again, it all depends on purpose. One cannot easily generalize. But with masking, for instance, among the Mende, women wear and dance with masks. And then we have traditions in many parts of Africa tracing the origin of masking to women before, at a certain point in time, the men took it over. Even among, not only Yoruba, among the Dogon, among the Senufo, among the Mende today, women still wear masks. So when we go into the history of artistic production in Africa, in fact, the idea that painting is not traditional to Africa is false, because you go to the Sahara, you find ancient paintings dating to the BC. You go to South Africa, Apollo Cave, 27,000 BC. So it is not right to say painting is not an African medium of expression. In fact, I too wrote an article earlier under colonial influence, thinking that painting was not part of our artistic heritage. But of course, later, the works of the Sahara were discovered. So this was written before the Saharan works were found. Again, knowledge is always in flux. It's a process of definition and redefinition. And that is why knowledge is open-ended. And art, so too is art. As we learn more and more about African art, we begin to see that it is much deeper than we are taught.
Well, we have a wonderful panel here, and I cannot let anyone go who will share a thought with us. Will you? Did you have something else?
Yeah, I was just going to say that when we talk about women do this, men do this, there is the issue of what we call the anthropological present. It's as if this is the way it has always been, this is the way it will always be. Whereas when we say women do certain things, when did that start? In what context? And when we say the Yoruba, has it always been like that? Was it like that 1,000 years ago? If it is like that now, why is it like that? These are issues that we need to go into, and again, there are all kinds of women, there are all kinds of men. There are some men we call Okoni Baoro, men who come out only during certain, people who are not really men, so to say. And there are women who are very strong women. So when you say women cannot see that, and men cannot see this, all these restrictions have balances and checks that people usually do not put into consideration when we generalize.
Maybe I think that's a good point to make in many cultures that we talk about. Yeah. We talk about men and women and different groups, that we do not take into consideration the context in which that situation arose. And we would learn a lot more about ourselves rather than just saying it was a prejudice or it was a meanness if we discovered what it was. Are there other comments?
Somebody there.
Well, I was just about to cut off the questions. No.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to find out if among the Yoruba there is any difference in prestige for artworks created by women versus those created by men, either so-called traditionally or in contemporary context.
Would anyone? The man or the women?
I don't want to talk, but I don't want to talk again, but we know that in the past, from Oriki of artists, certain artists were reputed to have been patronized by kings, and individuals who had their works were very proud to display them. So not in the context of gender, but it all depends on the fame of the artist. So certain artists were known beyond the boundary of their own towns, and you find this all over the continent. And then the prestige is also is evident in the quality of the work. if you see a good work of art, you will recognize it. And people say, who did it? And there are many songs in praise of masters, ancient masters, Lagbaji and others, who lived in the 18th and the 17th centuries and so on. It is because of their faith and how artists carried poles, carved poles, hundreds of miles to the capital, accompanied by drumming. And we see all this in the literature, suggesting that patrons appreciated works by masters. And we have names of certain masters, male and female. Again, it all depends. And we have to study this, as Mr. Kediki has said.
Would you like to make a...
Yeah.
Yes.
I was merely going to conclude on this note that as a contemporary artist, despite my exposure and the appropriation of the sacred painting of Yoruba women, much as I've tried to borrow elements from their own artistry, I cannot appropriate the process because theirs is a sacred art form. I can only borrow elements from them, but my art will still remain a secular art that caters to my own audience, not necessarily within the sacred context in which these women paint their images.
Would you like to make a statement?
No. That's...
Another statement? Either of you? Well, I just can't tell you, I'm sure, how much all of us appreciate the depth and the care with which you have shared your experiences and your knowledge and your insights. I think it's been a very special evening, and I hope that we'll give the participants here a wonderful round of applause.